All right, well, I am taking off my Ryan Seacrest suit rather than just being the host. I actually get to spend a little fine quality time with you here, folks. We're going to be talking about improving AI decision modeling through utility theory. Again, I'm Dave Mark. This is Kevin Dill, my trusty sidekick, who is also the tech editor on my book on this subject. So this is something that we've been kind of evangelizing. More on that in a moment. My name is Dave Mark. I'm the president and lead designer of Intrinsic Algorithm in Omaha, Nebraska. We're an independent game studio and also an AI consulting company. And I'm also the author of Behavioral Mathematics for Game AI, a book that came out a year ago last Friday, just before GDC. And a lot of the stuff that you're going to see in here is covered in there, so if you want more information, that's a great place to look for it. Little shout out to Alex Champendard of AI Game Dev. A couple months ago, he put something on his retrospect of 2009 that I got kind of a kick out of. He was looking back saying up-and-coming things that were happening. And in his section on what's new for 2009, he says, he was talking about utility modeling and utility theory being something that's up-and-coming. He says, one thing, there's an agreed-upon name for the architecture. Kevin has been doing this for a while and been calling it goal-based architectures. Unfortunately, the goal thing comes with planning a lot of times, and so that name's been kind of co-opted. So utility-based architecture seems to be what we're calling it lately. We're making this up as we go. But the other thing that Alex said is a group of developers advocate building entire architectures around utility, not just sprinkling them throughout other types of architectures. And my good friend Alex went on to say, the second point is probably the most controversial. So we're here to hope, explain this a little bit better. But more succinctly, we also do requests. My buddy Dan Klein, you here, Dan? We were at AI IDE conference, and he was flipping through my book, and he goes, wow, you have a lot of stuff on utility modeling in here. You should do a lecture on this stuff at the AI Summit. So, hey, what the heck, here we are. Starting at the beginning, though, what is utility theory? This is straight off of Wikipedia. In economics, utility is a measure of the relative satisfaction from or desirability of consumption of various goods and services. And so therefore, given this measure, we can speak meaningfully of increasing or decreasing utility and thereby explain economic behavior in terms of attempts to increase one's utility. A lot of fancy words. What does it come down to? Basically, is how much is something worth to me? And we make these decisions all the time. Utility is not necessarily equal to value. So, for example, a $20 bill has a specified value of $20. It's listed right there on the front. However, if I am on a desert island and there's not a 7-Eleven in sight, the $20 bill has absolutely no utility for me. The value is unchanged, but the utility is negligible at that point. Of course, it allows comparisons between concepts, and because of that, it allows us to do decision analyses between competing interests, decide which one is better. And a phrase you hear a lot is maximization of expected utility. And what this means is if I look at the situation and say, how am I going to maximize what I'm getting out of the situation? You can also think of this in terms of like a chess tree search or min-max search. That's really all you're doing. You're scoring everything, you roll it all up and say, which of these choices that I can make right now gives me the best situation, the maximizing my expected utility for the rest of the game that would follow. So it's a very similar concept. It's also related to the disciplines of game theory and decision theory. Of course, John von Neumann was the one who wrote the book along with Oscar Morgenstern, Theory of Games and of Economic Behavior. That's great bedtime reading, by the way. 15 minutes, you're out. This was kind of the seminal book in 1944 that really, really went in depth in using game theory, utility theory, etc. It's no coincidence that the name includes economic behavior, because utility theory is very much used in economics for understanding decision making, and then through business modeling, of decision modeling in business. In fact, of course, we use it all the time. For example, just to make a decision, $40 for the conference lunch, or I go across the street and have a burger for $12. That's utility theory in economics, but on a personal level. And so people have been using a lot of utility theory in the realms of psychology and even biology of why things do what they do. So it's got a long and storied history, just not necessarily in game development. So by ascribing value to something, of course, we are able to analyze it. we can convert raw numbers into some usable concepts. We understand distance is 75. We have a picture of what that is. How much ammo do I have in my gun? We understand. That tells us something. How much health do I have? The medical field will be a little alarmed that we all reduce health to a number. But more importantly, though, we can convert these raw numbers into useful concepts that we can go forward and actually do something with. For example, distance could be converted somehow into a concept of how threatening is something to us. How much ammo we have can be converted into how necessary is it for me to reload my gun at this time. And the same thing with health. How necessary is it for me to heal based on the amount of health, the raw number that I have right now? But then we can go further, and as I mentioned before, it allows for comparison. So by assigning value to a selection, we can compare it to others. And this, of course, is the underpinnings of game theory with von Neumann and Morgenstern. So, for example, the classic prisoner's dilemma scenario, anybody who's studied prisoner's dilemma or in its various forms knows that the optimal solution is for both of the prisoners to stay silent and trust that the other guy is going to as well. That's the optimal situation, and we know that because we're looking at the values that are in that grid. Things get a little bit more interesting, however, if we go ahead and start covering up those values. And yes, we have to cover up goes free because that's a value of 0, right? Well, now, what do we do with this? We have no idea what we're supposed to do in prisoner's dilemma because we've taken away all those values that allowed us to compare our options. So at that point, really, the comparisons and the decisions then almost become impossible to make. So assigning value to something is really important. Marginal utility is another portion of this whole equation. What marginal utility is all about is utility is not always the same. So for example, and by the way, this really, really bothered Kevin when I showed it to him the other day because he hadn't had pizza in a long time. You'll understand in a second. If I'm really hungry and I like pizza and I haven't had a pizza in like 3 weeks or something, my utility for that slice of pizza is actually going to be fairly high. It means a lot to me. Okay, so I eat the slice of pizza and they give me a second one. Same size, same type, same quality, everything about it. The value of the second slice is exactly the same as the first. However, I'm not as hungry as I once was. It hasn't been 3 weeks since I had pizza. It's been 3 minutes. My utility for the second slice of pizza is not going to be as high as it was for the first. And the same thing, if I have a third slice, it's not going to be as high as my utility for the second or for the first. And so as I keep adding slices of pizza, eventually they're not going to mean as much to me. I'm kind of like, okay, dude, seriously, I'm done with the pizza by now, right? And so what that describes is decreasing marginal utility. Marginal utility being, what did I get out of adding one more? And so each additional unit, in this case, was worth less than the one before. And so the rate of increase of the total, the cumulative utility, was decreasing. So the utility of 20 slices is, of course, not the same as the utility of the first slice. It makes sense to us intuitively. So if we were to graph that out, as each slice had a decreasing marginal utility, the cumulative looks like something like this. Of course, I can make the case that eventually the marginal utility for another slice would start to be negative, and eventually that curve would look kind of something like this. Because eventually you're going to say, no, if I have one more slice, this is not good. The same thing happens with beer, as we all know. You end up with something like that. So yes, marginal utility can go from being positive to being negative with dire consequences. All right, let's go the other direction. Increasing marginal utility. Each additional unit is worth more than the one before. So for example, somebody gives you one Lego block. Congratulations. How's that working for you? This means nothing. They give you a couple more. Well, at least now you can kind of put them together and do something. But the more Lego that you get, the cooler stuff that you can make. So 20 Lego is far greater than 20 times that first Lego. So that's increasing marginal utility. So what we need to do is convert all this data to concepts and figure out really what does the information say to us. Raw data doesn't mean a lot without context. I can tell you, hey, I scored 5 billion points in that game. Okay, is that good? What's normal? Did they spot you 4 billion when you started? I don't know. Without any sort of context, you don't know what it means. It's ambiguous, and we really can't reason on it. You don't know is that good or bad. But we can use some techniques to make some sense of this raw data: conversion formulas, response curves, and normalization. And for those of you who don't know what normalization is, basically it's condensing whatever scale you're in down to 0 to 1. 0 is the absolute worst. It could be 1 is the absolute best. We're all used to this from back in elementary school when our tests were scored on a percentage basis. That's normalization. Doesn't matter how many points were on the test, how many questions, what's the percentage? Best or worst? All right, so to use an example of this, my trusty sidekick over here, Kevin, is going to be the monster in a game, okay? And he is going to have anxiety as I get closer to him. Maybe not that close, that's creepy. I am armed with a knife, okay? That's why Kevin might just get anxious if I approach him. So as I start walking towards him, Kevin's like, yeah, whatever, okay? And then at some point, this is how we do things in games. Think about this. He's not anxious, and now he is. And now he's not, and now he is. He doesn't attack me, now he does. What the heck is this? Well, it looks what this is an if-then statement. If my distance was under a certain a number of feet, for example, 30, his anxiety went from 0 to 1, and he attacked me. Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I don't know what this about this line right here that was so magical. All right, let's try it a different way. It makes sense that the closer I would get to him, the more anxious he would be, right? So it looks something like this, right? As I get closer to him, his anxiety is increasing, until I get right up close with my knife and I can actually stab him. And now, his anxiety is increased to the maximum. Something wrong with this also. That last step, I can't attack him and now I can, was the exact same increase in his anxiety as that first one over there, and all of the other ones in between. It's just this linear progression. That last step meant a heck of a lot more than these over here. So how about we do something like this? This is an exponential curve. You can see the cute little 3s up there at the top. And I did some twisting and turning to get it to fit. Notice it still starts at 0 and ends at 1. But it looks like this. I take the first few steps. He's like, yeah, whatever, right? As I get closer, now he's starting to get concerned. But when I get to that last 10, 20, 30 feet, his anxiety really starts to go up because now he's worried that I could get to him with my knife. Increasing marginal utility. So by changing the exponents, of course, we can tweak that curve of how it looks and how severe is the reaction, when does it change, whatnot. We can also shift the curve up, down, left, right. We can do all sorts of fun things to get exactly the experience that we want to Kevin to express. So let's look at the 3 of these together. There's our blue one with the threshold, the magic line, and the linear one, and then the increasing marginal utility. 3 different ways of expressing. They all started at 0 and they all ended at 1. It's how they got there that makes the difference. Another fun one to play with, the logistic function, which is a subset of sigmoid functions, which basically means S-shaped for all intents and purposes. In case anybody's curious, there's our little friend E, for those of you who like natural logarithms. Here's one. Again, I had to putz with it a little bit to fit it into our example. Starts at 0, ends at 1. This is what's different. I now have a squirt gun instead of a knife. There's going to be different characteristics here. I start heading out toward Kevin, and it's like, yeah, okay, now he's starting to get close to the range of the squirt gun. I'm getting a little worried. Now he's in the range of the squirt gun, but you know what? He's not very far into it, and I could always step out of it. But once I get well inside the range of my squirt gun, he's like, you know what? I'm really anxious. I'm pissed. I should fight him. And I don't know who would win. But so what we've established is kind of a soft threshold here, where outside, before it didn't matter so much. Inside it, once I was inside, hey, I can squirt him. Doesn't matter. But inside was where there was the major change. So there's a logistic function. Again, by changing some of the parameters, like the little 0.45 up there, I can change the shape of it. I can slide it back and forth to get exactly what I want to express how Kevin's anxiety would change. Obviously, if we did this, for example, if my squirt gun was more or less powerful, we could move that threshold around a little bit. So we compare it to the others. Again, starts at 0, ends at 1, but the journey, how it got there, expresses something completely different. That raw data of distance now is expressed in something that it makes sense to us. It really starts to craft his behavior. Breaking out of our example, but just because these are cool, a logit function, again, there's our little friend E there. It's also a sigmoid function. Basically, it's like a logistic curve turned on its side. But these are also very powerful and very common in a lot of psychology and biology, especially in situations where as you're moving away from a center point, you get more and more extreme reactions. So, for example, if we're walking down the street, there's a natural distance that we all have from another person when we're walking down. If we happen to wander one side or the other, the big deal. If we wander too close, it's like, oh, sorry. That's like the one end of that curve. But if I end up straying, you're over here. Think about that. Any sort of thing where there's a balance, one side or the other, we can feed it into that. Notice that it goes from -5 to +5 normally. And again, by tweaking the base of the log that we're using, depending on what we put it in there, we change the shape of the function. And also, like I said, -5 to +5. Well, heck, let's just add 5 to it. Now it's 0 to 10. Hey, while we're at it, let's divide it by 10. And now, fully normalized logit function 0 to 1. Okay? So this is a great way of crafting another type of behavior, depending on what it was that we were trying to do. So the question then is, when we look at the information that we're trying to express, how do we model it? Is it increasing or decreasing? What's the rate of change? Is it going to be something that's steady or variable, or that increasing marginal utility? Is there going to be an inflection point, like the sigmoid functions, that change direction at some point? And what's the amount of change? So these are questions that we would want to ask ourselves about the behavior we're trying to model, and then choose the appropriate function. And by no means was that an exhaustive list of functions. Those are some just very common ones. But what good is it? Remember we had the magic line, the 30 feet, when we said, hey, his anxiety went from 0 to 1, and then he attacked me, right? We could have just said, well, how about if the anxiety is above 0.8 or 0.6 or 0.3, and all of those curves then would have attacked me at 30 feet, just by changing what threshold. Here's the kicker. Utility theory is not for analyzing one piece of information in a vacuum by itself. It's for doing comparisons across them to say, remember, maximization of expected utility. Which of these things is going to be the most important to me? So by normalizing some utility values, we can define some relationships and comparisons that maybe would have been obscure before. So for example, risk versus reward. If we're gambling at the casino, money in, money out, we can compare those fairly easy. But risk versus reward a lot of times isn't necessarily on equal terms. Fear versus hate. I may fear you a lot, but at the moment I hate you more, so I'm going to attack you. It's the comparisons between the fear and hate that mattered at that point. And then ammo versus health. These things are measured in two completely different ways. How do we compare them? Hey, that's so much fun, we're going to use it as an example. I have 100 health. I'm maxed out. I've got a backpack full of health kits, right? I have 100 ammo in my machine gun and a backpack full of ammo. This is like true Doom style, where I have like a U-Haul on my back, right? As these two columns decrease, as these two values go down, which of the two makes you more anxious? As these are going, now we're 50 health, 50 ammo. 25 health, that's a little alarming, right? Never mind the gun at the moment. Find the Band-Aids, would you? 5 health, this is not good. We can always reload, but we got to live. Two completely different feels to those two types of things. So we can model it again using some of the curves that we just did. Let's take a look at those a little closer. What were our considerations at the moment? With the red curve, the healing, as our health decreased, our urgency to heal increased, of course. That makes sense, right? However, we also wanted to make sure we didn't get too low on health. On the other side of the equation, as ammo decreased, our urgency to reload increased. That makes sense also, right? However, it doesn't max out until we're actually out of ammo. Hey, ask Dirty Harry. As long as you got the one bullet left in the gun, you're golden, right? So two completely different feels here. But that doesn't tell us how to compare them. So what we want to do is collect some states of our independent variables at the time, normalize them using response curves, combine them if necessary. We'll get to that in a minute. And then compare our normalized values and select either the highest scoring one, or you can use these to seed weighted randoms. I think Tara mentioned that actually this morning in her lecture. Or you can do a weighted random from the top n choices. Like, let's just take the top 5 and do a weighted random from all of those. So we can choose how we're going to handle that. One more factor we're going to throw into this just to make this interesting is here's another exponential curve modeling some threat. As the number of enemies increase, the importance of engaging them is going to also increase in an exponential way. So, for example, if we had 5 enemies out there, we have a utility of 0.684 for engaging them. Never mind the numbers. It's the concept that counts. Here we go. Situation, 5 enemies, 50 ammo, 50 health currently, right? See all the curves? We're playing with our numbers here. And at that moment, using those formulas, engaging the enemy is the highest utility. So let's just pick that. We'll go ahead and keep shooting the enemy. That's fine. A few seconds later, we take some damage down in the bottom right there. Now we've gone from 50 health to 35, and it creeped up that logistic function real quick. Now, most important thing for us to do, because it's the highest utility, is go ahead and heal, right? Because, hey, we're down to 35 health. Not cool. All right, moving on. Let's say we heal. That goes down, and over here on the left, we're down to 10 ammo on our gun, and it climbs up that exponential curve. Our utility for reloading now goes up to 0.729. It's higher than the 684 for engaging the enemy, so we're going to go ahead and reload, right, at the moment. All right, so we go ahead and reload, and our utility drops down there. Now look up here in the upper right-hand corner. While we've been busy using Band-Aids and jamming stuff in our gun, our buddies have killed all the enemies, and so the utility for engaging the enemy is 0. Pay careful attention to what happens here. 0, 0.016, and 0.125. Those are all really low utilities. But because we're comparing them, we just pick whichever one's the highest. So we go ahead and heal, and we go ahead and reload our gun. Because there's nothing else going on. There's no enemies to shoot. So, yeah, we're not really hurting that bad, and we got a lot of ammo, but we might as well just do it anyway, because after all, it's kind of boring right now, and it is the most important thing for us to do. So we don't process just one action at a time and ask ourselves, should I attack? I don't know. Okay. Should I reload? Should I heal? Should I have a beer? We don't process one thing at a time. We compare all of the potential actions that we have at this moment to each other using those utility functions and the scores that we've generated, and say, of all of the things that I could do, which is the most important to do at this moment? Even if all of them are low priority, never mind that. We're not worried about a threshold to cross over. We're saying, what's the most important thing to do? So utility measurements can also model more than just simply tangible data, by the way. We can model abstract concepts like threat, like our safety, morale. How do you put a number on morale? Or emotions. Richard Evans is talking about how they used a lot of the personality stuff and modeled that in The Sims 3. They put numbers on everything. I love Richard to death. It was a fantastic model, very expressive, by modeling some abstract concepts with numbers. And then individual utilities can also be combined to form new conceptual ones. For example, let's say we wanted to add the idea of taking cover. Well, okay. Objectively, what do we need to consider when we are thinking about whether or not we should take cover? Obviously, am I under fire? That's important. But how about also this? If it's time to reload or if it's time to heal, I don't want to stand out here in the middle of the room and do it. I would rather go and do it in the privacy of my own podium. I'm going to do all my stuff down here, and then I'll come back when I'm done. So those are considerations in taking cover. So we can throw together a formula, and this is just something I threw together because the math worked out really cool. But look, we got two halves to this. We got this left side here, which is a kind of a baseline 0.2, plus the utility for reloading, plus the utility for healing, times 1.5, because healing is more important. And then also, on the right, times the amount of threat that we're under, plus another, or times another multiplier. Yes, I know the parentheses are optional. It just makes it easier to look at. So there's our formula. Let's run this through its paces and see what happens. Starting the situation, we don't need a reload. We don't need a heal. Those are 0, right? 0.6 utility for engaging the enemy. It's the highest thing. We go ahead and do that. All right, so we go and start fighting. We're taking some damage, and we're shooting some bullets, and so those are creeping up. And look what's happening over here. Our need to take cover is creeping up, but it's not the highest, so we're going to continue engaging the enemy. Eventually, we take enough damage, and we shoot enough bullets, and look what's happening. Now, between the necessity to reload, the necessity to heal, and the fact that we are facing a number of enemies, now taking cover is kind of important. So we're going to go ahead and do that. because it's the most important thing to do at the time. And notice this is all happening with this one formula changing cover. Even if reloading utility goes down, but the threat level was 0.8 instead of 0.6, we're still going to take cover, because this is all in play at the same time, and that cover utility is based on some combination of those other three. So look at what we've done. We've taken those three, made a fourth one, and then put them back in the bin to compare to each other again. So we had to take cover in that situation. Here's similar to what we had before. Yeah, we need to reload, we need to heal, but heck, there's no threat. So we're not going to engage necessarily. We're not going to take cover. Right now, the most important thing is for us to reload. Even if those were really, really high, way up there, if there's no threat, there's no need to take cover. And that the utility for that is fairly low. We just go ahead and handle our business out here in the middle of the room. Time can also be converted into a utility. We do this with A-star, obviously, with edge, the distances, of course, and then edge weights for terrain and stuff like that. But you can also include the utility of the time that it takes to complete something. So, for example, not to pick on Richard, but I was really annoyed one time when my sim was ready to go to bed. He was really tired, and he also needed to take a leak, really bad. I'm like, dude, don't go to bed. Don't do it, because you're going to get up. You know you're going to get up in like 2 hours, right? 2 minutes, take a pee, sleep for 8 hours. How long was the time commitment to actually do the task? And so those are things that can be factored in. And so we can use them directly for comparisons. Is this greater than this? But we can also use it to modify other utilities. So something may be more valuable if it's shorter or closer or whatever. So, for example, we have the red goal and the green goal, and they're each 10. They're the same. But I'm closer to the red goal. Matter of fact, the green goal is twice as far away. So you know what? All other things being equal, we go ahead and do the red goal. That makes sense, right? But what happens if the green goal is now 20? I'm still closer to the red goal. As a matter of fact, hey, it's twice as far away to the green goal. Not going to bother walking through this because it's very situation dependent. But we have to make a decision. Is the difference in the relative utility of the goals, 20 and 10, compared to the double the distance, the difference in the distances? Comparing those two and making a decision. Now remember, utility of time, we can also use our response curves like we did before. We could have increasing or decreasing marginal utility of each additional second we spend. So how we massage that, what does time mean to us, and how does it apply? So to go through an example actually from last year's AI Summit, where this came up and actually generated some great conversation, is Brett Laming was talking about his MARPO layered goal-based scenario, or architecture rather, and he painted this scenario where he says, okay, you have this big goal that you want to get in the car and drive across town to talk to somebody or do some noble deed or whatever. However, you look outside, and standing out next to your car is this dude that you're mad at, right? And you got to go talk to him. So you put the other goal on hold for a minute, and you say, I'm going to go over and talk to this guy with the idea that when I'm done, then I will get in the car and resume what I was doing before. And then during the questions, Neil Kirby asked a great question. He says, what happens if, when you see the guy and you decide, I got to go out and talk to him, you pass by your car keys on the table? And unfortunately, despite the fact that Brett's architecture is fantastic, he had to admit that in this case, no, he'd have to backtrack and then resume what he was doing. Because at the time that he took the key, or he superseded that goal, he took the keys out of consideration as a potential action, and so he neglected them as he walked by. So I told the guys, hey, I got an answer for that, just utility of time. So, for example, we do an inverse to the distance of the keys as a modifier for the utility of grabbing them. And it looks like this. This is kind of a contrived graph here. It's 20 feet before, and we pass the keys, and then 20 feet after. And look what happens with this formula. Is the utility for the commitment, the time commitment that it takes to get the keys, spikes as we pass them. They're right there. Just go. This isn't the utility for grabbing the keys is still the same. They're important to use for the car later and everything. But the time commitment, the modifier, is what spikes here. And so we can use it as a coefficient to modify that base utility of grabbing the keys. So here's our situation again. This time, remember, the keys are on the table. We want to get in the car, go across town. We start to head out to go talk to the dude that we see. But as we get close to the keys, that modifier, because of the time commitment and the distance, just goes through the roof because they're right there. We figure, what the heck? We're going to grab the keys and then go talk to the dude so we're ready to go. So by keeping the keys in consideration at all times and seeing at any moment, is it the best thing for us to do? And factoring in the utility of time, we just go ahead and get them as we pass on by. So you can take all sorts of inputs and start gluing them together and putting them together in pieces and parts to come up with one score. For example, you can layer this stuff. And notice that I never combine more than 2 of these things at a time. You can combine 2, 3, whatever's comfortable. But by doing it in boxes like this, it helps out in a couple of ways. It's first what I call compartmentalized confidence. Is you only have to worry about what's in that little black box at a time, and then take the output and send it on down the road. It's a lot easier to design, to tune, to tweak, etc., because you only have to look, well, where is this going wrong? You know what? Maybe we are putting too much of a priority on this one thing at this one time. So instead of building a big, huge, long formula, do it in pieces and parts. The other advantage to this is some of those pieces and parts may actually be used by other decision scores that we're putting together. So retreat, cover, attack. Some of these things might be used in other places. And even combined information can be used in other places. So data processing is not the same as actually processing the decision. This makes it a lot more scalable, too, because you're not processing everything, every frame for every character you have. Space it out, do it every n frames, or update some of that information like the threat if the threat changes. One of the enemies dies, rerun that number, and you just keep using it until such time as it changes. You can also split the data calculation off into separate processes, not only for calculations for the same agent for different decisions, but also for multiple agents. A lot of this information that you're going to process is going to end up being used by decisions of multiple agents. We're all fighting the same 7 guys out there, so we can use that same process data. And you can use a Blackboard architecture to manage and store this, etc., to slice up your time however you want. Also, it really lends itself well to multi-threading for that reason, is you can be processing a lot of this information in the background latently, dropping it into the buckets, and then the agents just go, what's in the bucket at the moment? I got to make a decision about something here. So remember, everything's relative. In a lot of decision processes, such as behavior trees and finite state machines, you do examine one choice at a time and say, should I do this one thing? Are there parameters that justify this one thing? And if not, only then do you move on to the next one, the next possibility in a pre-specified order. Well, what happens if no options meet their criteria? Do we have a fallback that may or may not be appropriate? It's also very susceptible to edge cases where, if only you had processed those in reverse order, it would have looked fine, but because you did them in this order instead, not so much. And so, remember, utility-based architectures always analyze all their options rather than just one instead. And they rate all of the options based on the respective factors. They select the one that's most appropriate, and not based on arbitrary independent thresholds like that 30-foot line that we had here. What's the best thing to do at the moment? And it handles those situational edge cases a lot better. And it's also easier to manage a lot of the potentially conflicting logic. So my contact information will be up again at the end. I was talking about things from the bottom up, raw data up. Kevin is going to cover how to make a decision from the top down.
Now am I turned on? Yay! All right. On the other hand, you've got this big bay windows on the 3rd floor with a great view of a used car lot. And there's no big bay windows on the 3rd floor with a great view of a used car lot. And there's no off-street parking. You could be driving around for 15 minutes trying to find a parking place every night. Lives upstairs, owns the place. The rent's real low. She hasn't split utilities, so electricity and water are included. You don't have to pay for those. It's this beautiful wooded lot. There's parks and bike trails nearby. But on the other hand, you've got a 45-minute commute to get back into the city to your job, and that's if traffic is good, which it probably isn't if you have to commute at rush hour. And there's no shopping anywhere close. It's like a 15-minute drive just to get to a grocery store. And as I said, the landlady lives right upstairs, so, she tends to go to bed like 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. You got to kind of keep it down. So, if that bothers you, that could be a problem. So the key insight that I had at some point along the way is that even though we've got 12 distinct pros and cons on those lists, there are really only 4 types of things that we're considering, and we can write shared code to reason about each of these things. So first of all, cost. Whether it's the cost of the utilities or the cost of the rent, it all goes into, what am I paying out every month? The distance to something, and it doesn't really matter what the something is. Pretty much every game that you ever work on is probably going to have distances in it. And there are sort of tricks to thinking about distances that are shared that you could reuse from place to place. So, the distance to work, the distance to shopping, the distance to parking, maybe the distance to recreation, like those parks and bike trails that we talked about. And then the aesthetics. So maybe the interior aesthetics, how nice is the apartment, or the exterior aesthetics, how nice is the lot that the apartment is on. And obviously there's a lot of variability in what people think is nice. So for instance, I don't really like loft apartments. On the other hand, my cousin-in-law thinks they're the best thing ever. So, we're going to pick differently based on that. And finally, the noise restrictions of the landlady living upstairs, so you got to be quiet at night. And the big thing is that these are reusable. So if I write code for reasoning about one of these things, then I can take it from decision to decision. So cost is probably used in lots of places, maybe aesthetics, much more game specific, but one of these things, then I can take it from decision to decision. So cost is probably used in lots of places, maybe aesthetics, much more game specific, but if I'm thinking about a place and distances and costs are definitely reusable not only in this game, but in lots of games. So looking at this again, you got the beautiful loft apartment. Well, that's aesthetics. Convenient shopping district close to work, no off-street parking. Those are all distances. Great view of a used car lot is aesthetics again. Low rent, utilities included, that's cost. Beautiful wooded lot is aesthetics. Nearby parks and bike trails, maybe aesthetics, maybe distance, maybe a little of both. 45-minute commute, no shopping nearby are distances. And landlady lives right upstairs is a noise restriction. So that's great, but that doesn't really tell you anything until you have a character, because remember I said individual preferences make a big difference on this. So let's say I have a character named Executive Joe, right? Joe's a high-powered executive at a big bank, and despite all of Obama's best efforts, Joe still makes lots of money. He's getting multi-million-dollar bonuses every year. So Joe really doesn't care what his apartment costs. It's just not even important to him. On the other hand, Joe is a workaholic. He's always at work. He doesn't get home till after dark, so exterior aesthetics really don't matter to him at all. Distance to recreation also doesn't matter because he doesn't recreate. He only works. On the other hand, his distance to work, to shopping, and to parking matter a lot because he's a busy guy. He doesn't have time to be driving around. And the last thing you need to know about Joe is Joe likes to throw big parties. He likes to show off how rich and important he is, so he invites all his friends over. Interior aesthetics really matter to him. He wants an apartment that's kind of a chick magnet. And of course, Joe is not fond of noise restrictions because his parties get pretty crazy. They run till 3 in the morning, and he doesn't want the landlord knocking on the door telling him to turn it down. So Joe's going to look at these 2 apartments, and this is what he's going to say. That first apartment looks pretty good. He really likes the beautiful loft apartment. The aesthetics are great. Close to shopping, close to work, that's nice. The only thing that kind of upsets him is there's no off-street parking. But hey, it's right downtown. Maybe there's nothing else that has off-street parking. So, that's something maybe he could live with. On the other hand, the second apartment is horrible. He doesn't care about any of the pros. The rent, the wooded lot, the nearby parks and bike trails. Doesn't care about any of that. But the 45-minute commute and the no shopping nearby is a real pain. And the fact that the landlady lives upstairs is a complete, that's a complete non-starter for him. On the other hand, you could have a different character, Stan the family man, right? Stan is the kind of guy who just goes into work to do his time, and then he comes home to his family. So he's, a 40-hour-a-week, maybe even a 35-hour-a-week kind of a guy. Stan's wife wants a really nice place, lots of recreation for the kids. Stan's really just looking for something that he can afford. The apartment needs to be kid-friendly, so not something the kids are going to trash, and also not someplace that the kids are going to hurt themselves. But Stan kind of likes to drive, so, it gives him a little bit of peace and quiet away from the nagging wife and the screaming kids. It's kind of meditative, so he doesn't mind a longer commute or a drive to shopping. That's fine with him. And, of course, Stan's family goes to bed pretty early, 10 o'clock, so they're not going to have too much trouble with that landlady living upstairs. In fact, they probably think she's a nice old lady and get along great. So Stan's going to look at these same 2 apartments and see something completely different. Stan's going to say, he doesn't care about the convenient shopping or close to work. On the other hand, notice that beautiful loft apartment actually moved from the pros column to the cons column, because to Stan, that's actually something that, his kids are just going to trash that. So interior aesthetics are actually maybe a negative to him. And the other thing that we'll talk about in a minute is the worry about safety. His kids could hurt themselves in a beautiful loft apartment. Great view of a used car lot. As soon as his wife sees that, she's just going to walk right back out. And the no off-street parking, when you've got 3 kids and 17 bags of groceries, you don't want to be hiking a quarter mile back to your apartment. On the other hand, the second place, he loves the low rent, the free utilities. His wife loves the beautiful wooded lot. The kids are all over the parks and bike trails. And the cons, again, are all things that he doesn't care about. So Stan's definitely going to go for the second apartment instead of the first one. So that's great. That's a real-world example. But how does he make that work in code, right? How does that work in a game? So let's talk just real quick about some high principles, the kind of things that we'd like to see. So we'd like AI that's sort of modular, where I can take pieces like Dave's Lego blocks and plug them together. So I could have my decisions be made up of sort of atomic pieces of logic, which I'll call considerations. And we want to be able to easily add and remove these considerations. We also want it to be extensible, so we want to be able to add new types of considerations. So for instance, when we're putting Stan in, the designers say, oh, well, he's worried about the safety of his kids. Well, there's a new consideration that wasn't on my original list. So I want to be able to just add a safety consideration, code it up so it works for Stan, drop it in, maybe half a day, add it to that decision, and all of a sudden it works. And we want our considerations to be reusable. So we want to be able to take them and reuse them from decision to decision within our project, and also from project to project, ideally. So just some real quick terminology in architecture. I'll talk about a reasoner as the high-level thing that's making decisions. Everybody's probably used to that. I say a reasoner has a list of choices. They could be states. They could be steps in a plan. They could be behaviors in a behavior tree. Things like play with a ball. They could be states. They could be steps in a plan. They could be behaviors in a behavior tree. Things like play with a ball, build a swordsman unit, select a particular weapon, play a particular animation, whatever the reasoner on to choices. And each consideration evaluates one aspect of the decision. Or one aspect of the situation. And then the considerations generate appraisals, and you somehow need to be able to combine the appraisals back together to make a final decision. And I'll talk more about how to do that. So again, a consideration encapsulates one aspect of a larger decision. So you could have things like distance, we already talked about. Maybe the selection history, so maybe you want to have some hysteresis and keep doing the thing that you're currently doing. Or maybe if you did something recently, you don't want to do it again. So for instance, if you just ate, you probably shouldn't eat again right away because it looks a little strange. Unless it's pizza, but that could get bad. Cost-benefit analysis, whatever other things go into making decisions. You could end up with 10 of these. You could end up with 50 or 60 of these. And then they need to be parameterized for easy customization, because every situation is different. Every character is different. So they need to be parameterized for this decision and for this character. And those parameters really control what ends up happening. So for those of you who are not coders, I promise this is the only piece of code that I will put up in this talk. But I just wanted to show really quickly what the interface for that might look like. So really there are only 2 functions that all of these considerations need to implement. One is a load function that loads in that parameterization, and the other is the evaluate function that creates the appraisal. And these 2 functions rely on 3 things: the data node that they're going to load, the context, which is the situation in the game, and the appraisal. So I'll talk about all 3 of those real quick. The data node is XML or some equivalent. Maybe you have your own custom format. It could be tool generated, so it could be instead of editing raw XML, you have a tool that lets you set up the AI, and then you just hit save in the tool, and you can the game loads that up. And it could be part of a larger AI specification. So for instance, when we did Boss AI for Iron Man, everything was specified in data. And so, the boss would appear somewhere in the data, and inside of the boss would be the AI that said, hey, it's running one of our AIs. And inside the AI would be a list of all the things that it could do, right? A list of its choices, like the different weapons it could fire, other actions it could take, like recharging or using a shield or dodging or something like that. And then inside of each of those choices would be the list of considerations. And inside of each consideration, finally, would be this data node, the parameterization for that consideration that says, how should it take into account the situation for that one particular thing. The context is just sort of an umbrella for, you need to abstract away everything that the AI needs to know about the game. So the context could be as simple as just a pointer to the game, and then the AI is responsible for digging into the game and getting the data it needs. The problem with that is then when you try and carry these things from project to project, the game engine is likely to change. And so that's not going to work out so well for you. So you'd like to sort of abstract that out and have a clean interface that the AI knows how to interpret, and then when you go to a new game, you just have to implement that interface in the game. Yeah, so I said all of that. Last thing is the appraisal. So the appraisal is the interesting stuff, right? So the appraisal, you know, is generated by the evaluate function, drives our final decision. So we're going to combine these things together, and then based on what we get, probably a utility or something like that, we're going to make a decision. There's lots of different ways we can make that decision. We could be using purely Boolean logic, so maybe every appraisal needs to return true. So basically, you just have a logic land between the considerations. Maybe you add a logical order to that. This being a utility talk and me being a utility kind of guy, that's not what I would do. I would tend to do something like take the one with the highest score, use weight-based random between them based on the scores, or maybe I'm doing something more complicated, like I'm optimizing resource allocation between a bunch of different choices in order to maximize overall utility. I've done all of these things in games. But experience has sort of suggested to me that you should start as simple as possible and extend only when necessary. And then the corollary to that is you should try and put in default values that mean if you do have complicated stuff, by default it doesn't do anything and you don't have to worry about it, so that when you're adding new considerations, you're thinking about as little as possible, and if you have designers doing it, it's as hard as possible for them to mess it up. So probably the simplest place that I would start, a simple utility-based appraisal. Each appraisal should probably have two things. One is the base score, which is just how good does this particular consideration think that the situation is. And the other is a veto. So you want your considerations to be able to say, you know what, there's something about the situation that says to me, don't do this thing. For instance, I'm considering shooting at you, but I have no ammo. So I don't want to mess with the base score. I want to be able to just say, you know what, in this situation, don't shoot because you have no ammo. Pick something else to do, like maybe a different weapon, maybe run away, whatever your other choices are. So then to calculate the total utility for a choice, first you go through all the considerations and check if any of those vetoes got set to false. I do it kind of backwards, so a veto of false means don't do it. In which case you just set the utility to 0, and of course the utility of 0 means don't do this thing. Otherwise you add all of the base scores together. And utility for this action is the total of all of the base scores. So for example, let's say you're picking weapons. This is an example that both Dave and I seem to come back to. It makes for a really good example, but it also actually makes for a really good case for doing this. I have done this in games for weapon selection. So you start probably with something like a tuning consideration. The idea behind a tuning consideration is it's just there to let you tune the AI. So all it does is pass through whatever values are specified in the data. So it passes through, in this case, the base score and the veto that are specified in the data. So base score is kind of self-explanatory. Why do you need veto? Well, you might want to turn off some of the possible behaviors in order to do testing, for instance. So again, in Iron Man, if we wanted to test just a few things in isolation, we would go and turn off, set the vetoes to false for the things we didn't want to see in the data, and then we could test real quickly and then change them back. And in fact, we shipped with some things with vetoes set to false because they didn't work out as well as we wanted them to. Next thing you need to do, so now let's say, going back one, with a tuning consideration, you've got a pistol and a sniper rifle. So you set the pistol to, maybe a score of 3 and the sniper rifle to a score of 5. Sniper rifles in general are a little better than pistols. But now you need to worry about range. So the ranges on these things are very different. For the pistol, maybe you just say if the range is more than 30 meters, then set the veto to false. So beyond 30 meters, don't use the pistol. Within 30 meters, the score of the pistol is 3 so far. And then with the sniper rifle, you say, well, beyond, 300 meters, set the veto to false because you can't hit anything. But the rifle is pretty good at longer ranges, so that's fine. But then when you get underneath, when you get within 30 meters, maybe you start ramping that score down. So the way you can ramp that score down is having your base score be negative. So now you're adding on a negative value that's decreasing that score from 5 down to 0. And maybe there's some point around 15 meters where the pistol actually becomes better than the sniper rifle. So the problem with that is you get the sort of thing Dave was talking about where, I take one step forward and he pulls out the pistol, and I take one step back and he pulls out the sniper rifle, and I take one step forward. And so he never actually gets a shot off because he's too busy changing weapons, and I just plug away till he's dead. So you need something like an inertia consideration, or, you could call it hysteresis, that just adds utility to whatever you're currently doing so that you don't change unless you've got a reason to. And you want some randomness, so if you've got a bunch of characters all standing at, say, 20 meters, you want most of them to pull out sniper rifles, but some of them should still pull out pistols, so you add some random noise to mix it up when there's some doubt as to which is the best thing. And then, as I suggested earlier, if you've got no ammo, you could have an ammo consideration. And all the ammo consideration is doing is setting the veto. So its score is always 0, but it'll set the veto to false if you have no ammo. Same thing, maybe you have characters who have trouble with grenade weapons indoors. Maybe they tend to blow up their friends. So easiest way to fix this, right, you're about to ship the game and you just discovered this bug. Easiest way to fix this is add a consideration that says, hey, if you're indoors, don't use grenades. Just put it on all the grenade weapons, bam, done. And finally, you select the weapon with the best total score. So slightly more complicated than those simple appraisals is an appraisal with a multiplier. And just as a side note, this is probably my preferred approach. This is usually where I start. So the idea here is instead of having a veto, we have a final multiplier. And now to get your score, you add all the base scores together, and then you get one total score based on all the base scores, and then you multiply by all the multipliers. So notice that if you have a multiplier of 0, then that's still a veto, because anything times 0 is still 0. Each consideration still has the ability to veto any particular choice. The nice thing about this is it lets you scale your utility more smoothly or more cleanly. So if you think about the sniper rifle, for instance, as we're going from 5 down to 0, we were doing that by adding on negative utility, and that would work. But now I've got a dependency between those two considerations. So if I go and rebalance my tuning considerations and change the base value of the sniper rifle, say, to an 8, then all of a sudden my range consideration isn't going to work, and a bug's going to pop up if I don't think about it, and then I'm going to have to go retune it later. Well, if my range consideration instead used the final multiplier that ramped from a score of 1 down to a score of 0, then no matter what the base score was, it would still ramp down smoothly. And you could add other things besides multipliers. You could add exponents. You could add polynomials. You could do any of the fancy stuff that Dave does. It just sort of is, a matter of what tools do you need. And again, I would suggest having the default values be set up so that if you don't say anything, then, for instance, the exponent is always 1, the multiplier is always 1, the base score is always 0. So you only have to think about the things that this consideration really needs to do. Last type of appraisal I'll talk about is a multi-utility appraisal. The idea here is that we're adding a priority attribute to the appraisal. And this really gives me a way to say if something is true, then only consider this small set of options. So the way I make that work is when I combine the appraisals together, I only consider options. When I combine the appraisals together, the priority becomes the maximum of the priority for any consideration. So a consideration is capable of saying, for instance, the priority of this action is 10. And then I don't consider anything that doesn't have a priority of 10 no matter what its score is. So I've got more than one utility working together. Kind of lets me split parts of the decision out. So for example, maybe I've got a game where melee weapons are much better than ranged weapons. So if I'm at close range within 1 or 2 meters, then I want to force the use of a melee weapon. So my range consideration could, in that situation, set the priority to be 10. And for ranged weapons, it would set the priority to be 0. And then I wouldn't consider any ranged weapons as long as I had a melee weapon that I could use. And the same thing at longer ranges, like more than, say, 10 meters, I want to force the use of a ranged weapon if I've got one, because by the time I run up and start hitting him with a melee weapon, I'm going to be dead. So there I set the priority of the ranged weapon to be 10 and the melee weapon to be 0. So in summary, I hope I convinced you that this approach will let you build your AI in a way that's more modular. You can sort of plug pieces together. It's extensible, and those pieces are reusable. And just to sort of maybe give it a little more, make it a little more convincing, I have taken this approach in a number of games. I'm not just making this stuff up. So Kohan 2 was a real-time strategy game where some of these ideas started to appear. The whole thing hadn't quite worked itself out in my head yet, but we definitely had things like economic value and military value that reappeared in lots of different decisions. First time I implemented this was a prototype dog AI that I did at Bluefang, where we were working on next generation AI. The Iron Man boss AI used it. We used it for a couple of different decisions in Red Dead Redemption, and the upcoming game, All Heroes Die, which is an indie game that I'm only sort of kind of working a little bit on. But that game is very heavily based on picking events that could happen that sort of drive the game story. And the situation for the code for event selection is completely based on this approach. And in fact, multi-priority appraisals so that they can have follow-up events based on earlier events. A couple of quick references, some things that I wrote, some things that Dave wrote, specifically his book. A couple other papers based on this stuff, so if you're interested in it, some other things that you might try reading. And that's it. So I guess we have some time for questions.
Hi, thank you. Very informative talk. What is not good for?
Sorry, could you ask that again?
What is a utility theory not good for?
I'm sorry, I got a request from Brett. What was the question again?
Okay.
He's going to pick me apart in a second, so go ahead.
What is utility theory not good at? It seems to be very good at everything.
I'm having a hard time because we're behind the speakers here.
So the question is...
Oh, tune in tomorrow. Actually, that's not a facetious answer. We're going up against the behavior tree guys in a panel tomorrow and some planner people. But there is utility theory and utility-based architectures for everything? Absolutely not. What it is likely better for, if I can answer the opposite side of your question here, is things where you have a lot of possibilities, a lot of potential actions, real-time strategy games, anything with strategic dispositions, for example, games where there's a lot of choices, RPGs. So are there times when, and especially for simpler characters, where they're not having to make really elaborate advanced decisions because, after all, they're going to be dead in 7 seconds? Now, obviously, some of the other things, whether it be state machines or behavior trees, are going to be fine. Are there places... I'd like to make the case, and this is probably a little pretentious, that anything that can be done in one of the other architectures, utility architectures can do. But on the other hand, you could also say that about some of the other ones. We could all do all of this in finite state machines. It just depends on how much hair you have to pull out. Because eventually you're going to get the exponential explosions of all your transitions, and managing it's a pain in the butt. So again, is there ever one thing that is absolutely right, absolutely wrong? No, it crosses over. So
I think of it as a toolbox. Different reasoning architectures are good in different situations. Planners are good when you need a sequence of actions. Finite state machines are good when you have something real simple or some basic simple cycles. Utility-based architectures I tend to think are good when you've got a lot of shades of gray, or you've got a lot of different things that you want to go into making a decision. So, for example, if I'm thinking about running away, then I could be thinking about, and I'm stealing one of Dave's examples here, I could be thinking about how much health I have and how much health the other guy has, and I could be thinking about how many of them are left and how many of my friends are left, and do I have cover and do they have cover, and how courageous am I, and all of these things sort of get combined together. So I could create an if statement with all of those as Booleans, but it gets pretty ugly. And that's where utilities start to be nice.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I was wondering, let's say I have two options, either walk somewhere or shoot someone. With the utility, let's say I'm walking towards them, and then when I get really close to them, I take out my weapon and shoot. But the best thing would be to, while I'm walking, actually take the weapon out and prepare for shooting. So is there a way to make this try to prepare for multiple things at the same time?
You absolutely can. Kohan 2 is a real-time strategy game. The opposing player AI was all utility-based, so you could be exploring and attacking and building things all at the same time.
I think he's probably talking about in one agent, however, as you're walking toward him, you said take out a weapon to prepare to shoot.
Yes.
So
to specifically answer that, I would say that getting out a weapon, arming yourself, is a separate activity. Which, if you think about it, and I hate to really diverge, if you think about it in terms of a planner, prerequisites for shooting somebody is you have to arm yourself, okay? And so, therefore, that is going to have, just like getting the keys in Brett's example, to get to use the car. The utility of arming yourself is going to be as high, and especially greater, to that of shooting somebody until such time as it's satisfied. That's kind of a kludged up way of doing it, but the point being is that's how you have to think, is that is an atomic action that is going to have ramifications down the road. I have to do this, so therefore it's going to have a high priority, so that once it's out of the way, now I can shoot somebody.
But you can also take an approach like the real-time strategy game where you have resources that are being applied to things. Well, maybe my resources are my arms and my legs. So my legs are walking towards somebody, but my arms are free. If I can draw a weapon with just my arms, then great. So yeah, there's no reason why you can't. You just need to think about the needs of your game and then
Yeah, I
make
was
it work.
thinking maybe it would stop it, because if you can only do one thing at one time, then you would stop doing something to arm yourself instead of being able to do both at the same time. But if you break it up, like walking is separate from the hands, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're talking about the larger picture of having, like you said, splitting out the different. The animation guys have the same question all the time of, well, just because I'm doing something with my legs doesn't prohibit me from doing something else with my hands. And so at that point, you're running two different reasoners. You know, what's the best thing for me to do from a locomotion standpoint, and what's the best thing to do from a weaponry standpoint? And those outputs, of course, affect different parts of the agent. Obviously, locomotion and, you know, whatever you're doing as far as getting your gun or reloading or changing guns or firing, that's all independent a lot of times of actual motion. So we got a couple more questions and only a couple more minutes, and we better just get onto the table for this, because here it comes.
Well, this is going to be revenge for the bloody key question.
I don't know this guy, by the way.
No, it is kind of Dave.
I told you
Dave
not to
Hahn.
double check this. This is just
No.
garbage that I threw up there. Go ahead.
Nice equation. So let's say it's a behavior in whichever architecture you're doing. So we're trying to work out if we should take cover. Beautiful equation. Fighting it is the behavior that kind of says, I want to reload. Fighting it is the behavior that says, I want to heal. All of which are presumably vying for the same attention, even if you use a maximum or a thing. So how do you reconcile that equation, which is essentially 3D parameter space, by the different behaviors and maintain the hysteresis zones?
Well, adding hysteresis is something that's completely beyond the scope of what I was talking about here. Yes, but that's a good point. Is you can modify through another layer of adding, you know, some utilities, perhaps with some decay values of, you know, with a cooldown period. Think about the cooldown periods we're used to in some of the games. You can do a cooldown utility. For example, if once I've started this, it jumps up the priority for choosing it, and it goes down. But yeah, you have things that they are going to be competing. As for example, I might get to the point where I want to reload. You know, if I were to look through, you know, some of these, I get to the point where I want to reload, but somebody then kills one of the guys, and it's not as important for me to take cover. You know, all of those things are intertwined. But yeah, if you build in that decision momentum as a modifier, as a coefficient to certain values, that once you've started a process, you're going to continue it, you know, et cetera, then you can build that sort of the decision inertia, decision momentum, hysteresis, any of those different types of things into the utilities themselves, so they stay up at the top of the decision until that's no longer a factor, et cetera.
Do you think a designer could
Dude,
choose...
I'll buy you a beer. We'll talk. Let's get to one more question. We got to head out of here.
Okay. One thing I noticed in all of this discussion is that it's predicated on a deterministic universe. And I think your utilities change dramatically, or at least your analysis of your utilities change in a stochastic universe. Say, example, playing the lottery. Winning the lottery has great utility, okay? But playing the lottery has much lower utility because you have to factor in the odds of success. Like shooting, I might not hit you. So how do you factor in your odds of success? Because sometimes you try to take an action and it fails. And it seems like that failure mode is not in the current analysis as you outlined in this talk.
It can be if you consider things like the probability of success. You can actually start getting into, you know, where appropriate, Bayesian and Markov, you know, technologies to start saying, okay, I don't necessarily know that this is a guaranteed outcome if I choose this. So you modify it, you know, using, you know, percent chance of success and estimate. And of course, those are all dynamic. And it just adds another layer of, think about it for this example this way. Never mind randomness. In a chess tree search, you're saying, all other things being equal, this is my best choice. Could it still go horribly wrong? Absolutely. It all depends on what else is happening. If you consider the other player being the randomness.
Right.
But at this moment, based on what I know and what could potentially happen, this is my best choice. And so instead of using the other player as your randomness, you are going to use some sort of, you know, inference, either a priori or you know, other sorts of, you know, expert system-based things to say, yeah, this has only got a 10% chance. I'm going to have to figure that into, you know, it looks great if I win, fantastic.
But you
but
might not
rationally,
know that, you might not know that when you're doing your initial analysis. Like in a game, you don't know that this action might work against this player or not, or you might not even know the odds of success of this strategy achieving success.
and yet that's what we deal with every time. When you're constructing a behavior tree or a hierarchical finite state machine or even a planner, you don't know that any of those things are going to work, so you really can't burn a lot of calories on it. You have to do your best guess what looks the most reasonable in the situation.
Or you could apply learning.
Or you could.
Thanks.
Good luck with that. So, yeah, you can use the utility variables instead of coefficients, constant coefficients. Just start feeding in your which is very similar to what I was saying. So we need to clear out, guys. We got 10 minutes before the next session. So I'm not going to promise you that there's food out there this time because I crashed and burned when I did last time. Thanks again, folks. Appreciate it. Hey. And